We're looking together at the moment at the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, I think, is a timely book for us to be looking at. At the time of Nehemiah and his work and his ministry, the city of Jerusalem didn't look the way it should. The people, many of them had been taken away and enslaved, taken from their homes, taken from the land that God had put them in. The city itself was in ruins. The wall of Jerusalem was broken down and the gates had been burned with fire. It didn't look the way it should. This didn't look like the city of the God of heaven and earth. And in the book of Nehemiah, what we see is an opening for a man, Nehemiah, and for other Jews to begin to rebuild the city, to begin to make that city look the way it should again. And they had the help of God in doing that. And as I said, it seems to be a book that's relevant to us today. Church life doesn't look the way it should. We haven't been meeting together in the way that we have been accustomed to. We haven't been able to worship in the way that the Lord prescribes us to worship. We haven't enjoyed the fellowship, the time together that we've wanted to enjoy. We've been restricted in terms of physical contact and so many other things. And now we're seeking to rebuild. There's an image in the book of Nehemiah of there being gaps in the wall. And I think that's very much how church life has felt. Yes, we have actually at St. Paul's been meeting consistently since December. And yet there felt like gaps in the wall. I felt that as I looked out on the pews and I see gaps between the people. But it seems now that perhaps we have this opportunity to close up the gaps, to start some of those ministries that haven't been carried on for some time, to get together more often and in more intimate ways, and to get to know and to love one another more, because the physical contact that we're going to be able to share and so on, and the greater worship that we're going to be able to offer, that's supposed to represent how we are with one another. And so we're going on a rebuilding project, much as Nehemiah was in his day. Nehemiah chapter 4 deals with opposition. And what we see in Nehemiah chapter 4 is that when the work of God begins to make some progress, you read in chapter 3 that the wall is beginning to be rebuilt and good progress is being made, and there are many hands involved in that work. Opposition begins to emerge, and there are some people, some groups that are really against what's happening, and they're against God, they're against his people. They don't want this wall to be rebuilt. And we keep meeting names: Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, and these come up again and again in the book of Nehemiah. These men and these groups, they really don't want the wall of Jerusalem to be built again. And they try a number of ways to undermine the work. First thing they do is to mock. So they just make fun of the project. They look at the state of the city, the state of the wall, the state of the rubble and everything, and they just make fun of it. You know, how are the Jews going to be able to rebuild this wall? Look at the mess. Are they really going to accomplish this? And then Tobiah says, you know, he looks at the progress that they've made, and he says, well, even if a fox were to climb on that wall, it would crumble underneath his feet. So there's that mockery. And mockery is intended to discourage, isn't it? It's intended to make the Jews who overhear it think, oh, do you know what? Maybe this is impossible. Maybe this is laughable. Maybe we should give up. So that's their first line of attack, if you like, mockery. And there's anger underneath that mockery. And it's interesting that mockery and laughter is the way that anger is displayed. And then that mockery is followed by threats. So the mockery doesn't work. The people pray and they devote themselves to the work and they carry on building and they make more progress. And then threats follow. So the enemies of this project begin to say, we're going to come in among them and we're going to kill them and we're going to stop the work from happening. And I don't know how serious they were about that threat, but even the making of that threat was intended again to discourage the people. Sometimes you hear of internal conversations, maybe in the corridors of power, being leaked to the media. And I often think to myself, well, was it a deliberate leak or an unintentional leak? Because sometimes private conversations are meant to come out to make you think a certain way. And I wonder this about the conversations that were happening back then. You know, when Tobiah and Sanballat and so on were saying, you know, we're going to come and kill them. We're going to stop them from building the wall. You know, was that a rumor that they wanted to get out? Was that something they wanted Nehemiah and the Jews to hear so that they would be afraid and slink back from the work? Perhaps it was. But the people don't stop building the wall. They're not intimidated by the threats that are coming in, and the mockery that's happening doesn't make them so discouraged that they give up. And I think the key expression that Nehemiah uses when he rallies the people and gets them to carry on is this. He tells them, remember the Lord. So he says to them, do not be afraid of them. Do not be afraid of these enemies who are trying to come in and stop this from happening. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. And I think that's a wonderful message to hear in the midst of opposition. Why did he tell them to remember the Lord? If you remember the Lord, then what you realize is that opposition to God and to you as a believer has no real power. God is the creator of heaven and earth. He therefore has power over everything, including our enemies. God is not like Dr. Frankenstein, who made a monster that he can't control. God has power over our enemies. If he didn't, then we'd have no assurance that good would eventually triumph over evil, that God would eventually triumph over the devil, and so on. God has power over all our enemies. Whatever they do to us, they can only ever do because God allows. So remember the Lord, says God to the Jews. You remember who God is, then that will be cause not to be afraid of your enemies. Remember the Lord. It looked to those on the outside that Jerusalem was in ruins because God was impotent and because the people were weak. But that wasn't the case. Jerusalem was in ruins because God had said to the people, and he said this through Moses about 1,000 years earlier, if you follow my commandments and obey them, then I will protect you and no harm will come to you or this city. But God said to them, if you disobey me, then I will scatter you. Then I will cause you to be enslaved and taken away by your enemies. Then I will cause this city to be desolate and a ruin. And so, the Jews would know, if they remembered the Lord, they would know that the city wall was only broken down because God allowed it. And God allowed it as a discipline for them. He was punishing them because of their great sins. If you read the books of Kings, you can read the tragic story of how the people got further and further away from God. Remember the Lord, because if you devote yourself to God, says Nehemiah, If you give yourself to obedience to him, nothing can stand in the way of the rebuilding of this wall. You will rebuild it. It will be built. Your opponents will have no power over you. The only condition you need to fulfill in the rebuilding of this wall is that you stick with God and you don't turn away from him. If you do that, he'll hold your enemies back, or he'll give you the victory over them. And I think that's a great message for the church today, that there is opposition, and we see it, don't we? I think we see it in the form of mockery, perhaps a bit less so now, but that was certainly how the church has been opposed up until recent times, where Christian values and beliefs have been made fun of in comedy programs. Clergy have generally been portrayed as absent-minded and idiotic. Christian people as bigoted and ignorant. So the subject of mockery, the work of the church as a bit of a joke, but also threats, I think, as well. So, it is the case that certain professions now are almost closed to Christians because of their moral convictions. So there are these threats coming in, as well as the mockery. We are facing opposition as we seek to do God's work. Now, God's work back then was the rebuilding of the wall. God's work today is the building of a Christian fellowship through the preaching of the word, through sharing our lives together. That's going to be opposed, but God says that opposition has no power at all. So we don't need to be afraid. God says to us the same. If you obey me, says God, if you devote yourself to my ways, then I will build your church. Then I will strengthen your fellowship. Then I will stop opposition from undermining and destroying what you're doing. If you disobey me, then your enemies will have the power over you. So we've got that message. Remember the Lord and do not be afraid of them. If we as Christians remember who God is, just as Nehemiah called the Jews to remember who God is, if we remember who God is, we've got no reason to be afraid of any opposition to the church. And we'll be more courageous. We will be moved, as the Jews were back then, to pray to God, both to pray that he would stop our enemies from opposing us, to get on with the work of building, to get on with the work of preaching the word, of making the word known to each other, of loving each other in every way possible, and to get on with the work of even of being prepared to fight. That is, to contend for the truth of God and for the cause of God in the world. So remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and do not be afraid of them. I think that's a very powerful message for today.